My name's Kennedy Hall. I'm a father. I have four children. I live in Canada. We have almost a foot of snow outside that fell today. It's much different than down there in Louisiana. And I wrote a book called Terror of Demons, Reclaiming Traditional Catholic Masculinity. I wrote another book called Family Be Damned, which is a book about how basically, it's, if anyone's ever read the Screw Tape Letters, it's in a similar fashion about sort of the psychology of how demons work against the family. In any case, so I was asked by Father, he asked me to come and talk about my work on Terror of Demons. Now, before I begin, some of what is in the book is admittedly very countercultural and very challenging. I imagine Father knew that as he invited me to do that, so I don't think there'll be any problems. But if there are any questions, because something I say is just very different than perhaps what we're used to hearing, please just ask me questions. Okay, so I'll get started here. Now, Terror of Demons is a book about Catholic masculinity. So the first thing we have to consider when we're talking about masculinity is we have to consider the fact that men and women are in fact different. That's a controversial truth nowadays. It's pretty simple. It was simple when I was a kid. I imagine it was simple about 5 years ago, but it's something that's not very simple anymore. We know the biological differences, and that's fine. That's pretty easy to understand. But there are qualitative differences as well between men and women. Probably 80% of the things that we do, we share characteristics. You know, it's not as if men are any better or worse at changing a diaper than a wife is. There's nothing inherently male or female about that. It's just something we do. But there are certain things that, in spite of what our culture says, there's certain things that we kind of tend to be better at or ought to be better at, just for the sake of a family especially. So a real easy example of that would be something like protecting your home. Of course, I mean, there's been famous Hollywood movies where the single mom, you know, protects her house from the burglar or something like that. But, you know, this is a funny thing you see even amongst the most progressive-minded feminist types, that they just really still like it when they have a man who's able to protect them. That's just something that's kind of innate. And that's quite a common characteristic. Oh, is that Father back there? I think I see a cassock. Hi. So men and women are different. Again, that's something maybe a little bit of a surprise to the Biden administration. But anyway, so when we discover that men and women are in fact different, well then, in our faith, we know that we have to develop our virtues. We have 4 cardinal virtues. We have our theological virtues. And we have to develop perfection of our virtues. So that's going to entail basically accepting who we are and then trying to find a way to perfect those things. So I wrote this book on masculinity because, in my opinion, you know, Father Chad Ripperger, he is one of the most famous online priests, if you want to call him that, you know, with all the sermons and things. He's a very well-known exorcist. And there's a meme that goes around, or it's just a picture of him with, you know, a quote. And he basically says the main problem with the church is effeminate men. Now, what does it mean to be an effeminate man? First of all, it does not mean being feminine, okay? Men and women are created differently, beautifully and wonderfully made by God. They have perfections in different ways. A woman is feminine, a man is masculine. Effeminacy sounds like the word feminine. It has nothing to do with being feminine. Sometimes, you know, in popular usage, you know, especially as we've gotten away from classical education, people will confuse the term effeminate to mean something like womanly. It's not really an appropriate usage. St. Thomas Aquinas defines effeminacy as a reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. So I'll repeat that. It's a reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. So I guess in a way it could be possible for you to say when it's effeminate, maybe it just doesn't usually apply. But with men, what we mean is because we're made in the image and likeness of God, and we think of Christ, we think of St. Joseph, we think of these models of the faith as being our greatest models of what it means to be a man, that really does mean embracing suffering and putting our pleasures aside for the people that we love, especially our wives and children, our flock if we're a pastor, and so forth. So it's a reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. So what are the roots of effeminacy? That's a really good question that we should ask. Well, Father Ripperger has a quote, and he says, "The real man is the man of virtue. With virtue comes interior self-discipline and self-control. It is the hallmark of a real man. He can engage in things that are hard and arduous and still remain steadfast. A man who wilts is effeminate." And in fact, when you look at the background of what that word actually means in the ancient languages, it does mean something like soft. So I think Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, I think he uses the example of a door that would yield easily to blows. So he says that's sort of an effeminate door. That sounds funny in English, but it's the fact that it just has no foundation. It's not strong. So the roots of effeminacy. Well, we find ourselves going back to the fall. We find ourselves going back to the Garden of Eden when sin entered the world through the actions of Adam and Eve. St. Thomas, along with other great saints and theologians, they tell us that original sin is pride. Now, this should give us pause when we think of pride as being something worthy of a celebration, as it is in our culture. I don't think it's an accident that that word is used. But in any case, original sin is pride, which is the primary sin of Adam and Eve. And pride is usually or traditionally defined as a desire to exalt oneself beyond what is appropriate for one's state or condition. So I'll repeat that. Pride is traditionally defined as the desire to exalt oneself beyond what is appropriate for one's state or condition. And basically that's because we are put where we're put by God, either by his active or permissive will. If I'm a father of a family, it's sort of a prideful thing for me to want to go do things that will greatly take away from my ability to serve my family. That's going to be just for me. It's not going to be about them. It's going to be just for me. It's a prideful thing. And we see this with Adam and Eve, with the fall. Basically, they're seeking equality with God. Okay, so this is demonstrated in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, and the serpent tempts Eve, and the devil says, "For God doth know that in what day soever you shall eat thereof, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." It's the classic story of the forbidden fruit. Eve is attracted to the possibility of seeking equality with God, which is the sin that cast Lucifer out of heaven in the first place. So we have these capital sins or vices. So we have pride, envy, wrath, and so forth. But then we also have underneath those, we have what we might be able to call daughter sins or sub sins. Okay, so for example, if I look at my notes here, we have lust, but we also have sub sins of that, okay, or daughters of that. So, for example, it's something that we might not ever consider, but having a problem with food, okay, not enjoying feasting. Feasting is a wonderful thing, but something like emotional eating, technically speaking, is kind of a lustful sin. The reason for that is because it's something where we attach our pleasure to an earthly good to satisfy an emotional or spiritual need. Okay, this is why. So for example, if somebody was struggling with lust, which many men and women do because of what's on the internet, for example, it's not easy enough to just say to somebody, "Go and stop watching that." It's like that's not going to work because there's so many habits that we have to root out. So, for example, if I was dealing with a young person, let's say, who was struggling with internet vice, we'll call it that. I would say, sure, get rid of your phone, get controls on your computers, all those practical things. And I'd say, but you know what? You're going to have to start fasting as the primary thing. You're going to have to start doing some harder exercise as your primary thing, because you're going to have to embrace physical suffering and forego the physical pleasures. And they're going to say, what does that have to do with, sexual temptation? It has everything to do with that, because you're training your appetites that lead up to these really terrible sins. So these major sins have their sub sins to them. Okay, so effeminacy is part of that. So it's possible to commit more than one sin at once, for example, and we don't have to go into that too much here. But effeminacy, it's sort of a combination of a few different sins. But basically, when we look at what happens with Adam and Eve, we see that the order of their original marriage it's the original primordial unit created by God. And imagine the scene for just a second here. You're in the Garden of Eden. It's a pretty great place. And in walks the serpent. However, he got in there. God's permissive will, I don't know. And that's an intruder in your home. Me as a husband, I've my wife, my beautiful wife, she's downstairs with my 4 children. If I heard someone trying to get in the window over there, I wouldn't say, "Sweetie, can you go see what's at the window?" I would deal with the problem. Well, she might even say to me, for example, "No, I'm going to handle it." And I would say, "No, I've got to handle it. Like, this is not appropriate for you, mother of my children, to be doing something so dangerous. That would be basically cowardly of me to do that." So what we see with Adam and Eve is we see basically the 2 fundamental sins that plague marriages and our culture today. And again, this is where I get into hot water with people. Clearly, there's nothing wrong with understanding the equal dignity of men and women, but there's a big difference between that and the modern feminist ideal, where we try to basically, we look at women and we say, as long as they do what a man can do, that makes them a good woman. That's kind of insulting to women, to be honest. As I said earlier, we have our perfections. We want to cultivate those as men and women. So we see with Adam and Eve, basically, Eve is dealing with the devil, and they're both culpable for that, Adam and Eve. Adam is committing an effeminate sin there because he's basically standing back and allowing his wife to deal with the intruder. Eve is committing a sin of what's called usurpation, which is basically usurping her husband's role as the head and protector of the family. And that's where that original marital disorder comes in. So this is why when we see this troubling passage, it's very hard for us to understand in Genesis, where I'll paraphrase, but where basically it says, your desire shall be for your husband, but he shall rule over you. That's the paradox. That's the paradox that we have with men and women in marriages since the fall, is that there is this power struggle, even though we desire one another. It's very strange. And it's something we always have to deal with. And anyone who's been married for a short time or a long amount of time, especially when they're trying to be faithful, they'll tell you that it's something that we have to constantly battle against. And our culture encourages that. I mean, our culture exalts basically anything that a woman can do in our culture, except be a mother, is what they think is the best, which is so backwards. I mean, it's like, I look at, for example, I take like an eagle or something. If you said, well, what's great about that eagle? Nothing to do with flying, everything else. It's like the eagle was made to fly, and it flies the greatest of all the birds. A woman is magic, the way that she's able to bear children and the things that she can do. That's not all there is, but that's a big part of it. And we should be promoting those feminine perfections. And our culture just doesn't like to do that for a lot of reasons. So that's basically the roots of effeminacy. We find them in the Garden of Eden. Now, as I said, effeminacy destroys male and female order, okay? Because what you see is, well, essentially you see, it's a common expression, happy wife, happy life. And I definitely understand why there's sort of a little bit of a funny motif to that. But often men will use that as a way of just avoiding conflict. And we both have to make sure that we're making decisions mutually in a marriage. But there has to be a clear and direct goal as a family, for example. And just letting things go because you don't want to have any conflict, that's just conflict avoidance. That's just, not facing a problem. And that's kind of the dominant theme. I mean, sitcoms are made about it. I mean, you think about like the Homer Simpson dad, right? That's the classic sort of North American dad. I don't watch a lot of TV anymore, but comes home, has a beer, sits on that's fine, but if we're avoiding the things that we have to do that are hard, and just sort of saying, whatever, as long as it's, everyone's happy, well, we might miss out on certain responsibilities. And that's kind of the disorder that we have in our families nowadays. It's perfectly personified with the dichotomy in marriages now because of contraception. This is something, and it's, my wife and I, I'm 32, she's 31. I mean, actually, she's perpetually 29, I should say that. And, but, we're open to life. We started taking the faith seriously about 6 years ago. Since then, we've had 4 children. God was very blessed us. We did lose a child earlier in November, actually. So perhaps you could pray for our family for that. But in any case, being open to life is really hard. And a lot of people in our culture, even in our church, they just take the road of contraception. But when you watch what happens, and actually there's a phenomenon, even secular doctors, they call the pill, they call it the divorce pill, Because here's this is a total side note here, but it's a fun little piece of trivia. There's these pheromones that men and women, emit, and you can't smell them with your senses, but you smell them in a hormonal sense. Okay, so these scientists, interested in these weird studies, they did basically, a study on male and female relationships due to these pheromones. You have to understand contraception. I mean, if a body is like an ecosystem, which it is, you're introducing something that completely makes the ecosystem work against itself. So you're going to have other problems. Just, classic, ecology 101. Well, what they did is basically they had a group of women, the test case or whatever. They had a group of women. They were on contraception for the first bit. Okay. And they had, this sounds weird, but they had a series of white t-shirts that they had various men wear throughout a day or two, and they couldn't have any deodorant, they couldn't have any scented soaps, they couldn't wash them, they just smelled like nothing but, anyway, the pheromones. So while the women were on contraception, they were basically, they went into a room and these t-shirts are just there, and the women were to go around and sniff the t-shirts and basically say, who do you find most attractive from what you smell? I know it sounds strange. Well, the women, for lack of a better term, they just, when they were on contraception, they picked a bunch of losers. They picked a bunch of guys who they would never think they would be attracted to. Okay, but they didn't tell them the results. Then what they did is they had the women get off contraception. And it was about 6 to 8 weeks, like a full, flush of the system. Everything was back to normal. They had them do the same thing. And all of them picked completely opposite men. And men that were much more successful, much more just virtuous men. Didn't have to be rich, but just conscientious men who had their stuff together. And they showed them the dichotomy, and they couldn't believe it. In fact, this is being used now by these matchmakers and things like that. This method in big cities where people have a hard time getting married because it's hard to find somebody to get married. And they're actually doing what they call t-shirt parties. And they have the same sort of standard for them where, you stay off contraception, the men wear these t-shirts, and they go around and they sniff these t-shirts, and they end up finding spouses because of this. That's how primordial this connection is between a true man and a true woman, and that's what contraception does to disrupt it. It's amazing. And there's more I could say about it, but that's sort of a pharmaceutical example of this effeminacy, this avoiding suffering. Being open to life does cause suffering, great joy, but a cross to bear nonetheless. Okay, not just having children, but also, you talk to anyone with a big family, it's very likely they've had miscarriages. Okay, that's just the odds. I mean, you have 7, 8, 9, 10 pregnancies. You lose some sometimes, and we lost. That just happened, but that's a real big cross that people have to have, and people don't want to have it, And then we give into we have a reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure, Anyway, so basically, what happens with this divorce pill, as I was saying, from these doctors were talking about it. Women, like these t-shirt study women, they will fall for a man while they're dating and single and whatever, while they're contracepting. Then what do you do once you get married? Well, now we're going to not contracept and we want to start having children. Well, hold on a sec. She's no longer attracted to her husband. And in fact, she kind of resents the guy. And it's so common in a lot of marriages to see the marriage either go in the toilet or for a divorce to happen within 1 or 2 kids. And I've just seen it happen to not a friend, but a friend of a friend who's my age. And same thing, very secular life, had a couple kids. They don't like each other anymore. It's funny how that works. Even doctors call it the divorce pill. Okay, so what are ways that we can defend against the basics of effeminacy? Well, the rosary. Okay, the rosary is, I think the rosary is a key to basically all of life's problems. If I didn't pray the rosary every day, I don't know if I could breathe. I can't, maybe I'll talk a little bit about my conversion later at Our Lady of Guadalupe, but the rosary is just the greatest thing. Anyway, but the rosary defends against effeminacy. And this was, I don't know where I heard this, but I put this in the book here. And I just want to I'm going to actually read a little bit here because I want to make sure I don't get it wrong. So the gospel, according to St. John, puts forth in the first 2 chapters a replaying of or representation of the creation by way of the coming of Christ. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 4 to 5, we see God's recognition of the goodness of light and the separation of the light from the darkness. This refers to not only a physical reality, but also to an event. This is a separation between the fallen demons and the good angels after Lucifer rejects the call to submit to God. In John, which is a rewriting of Genesis, in John chapter 1, verses 4 to 5, it refers to the life that is in Christ, and it says, is the light of men, and the light shineth in darkness, and darkness did not comprehend it. So right there we see a theological masterpiece as he shows the fulfillment of all things in Christ, starting with the creation. So if we skip to chapter 2 of John, we see the wedding at Cana. I believe that was just in the readings recently, the water into wine, which alludes to the marriage of Adam and Eve in the second chapter of Genesis. So chapter 2 in Genesis is a marriage, chapter 2 in John is a marriage. At this wedding, we see 6 jars of water that become wine, which refer to the 6 days of creation. We also see Mary, who is the new Eve, as the first to speak when approached by the serpents at the feast, and out of obedience, she defers directly to Jesus, who is the new Adam. After the wedding is concluded, John brings us to a scene in the temple where Jesus famously cleanses it of vendors and money changers. So I'll just pause there for a sec. We see a reversal of what happened in Genesis. So when the new Eve is presented with something, Mary, she defers to the head, who is Christ. In Genesis, it's the opposite. It's the confusing of the roles there, okay? Now, John brings us to a scene in the temple where Jesus famously cleanses it of vendors and money changers. Now, the temple prefigures the church, but it could also be said that the marriage prefigures the temple and is fulfilled by the church and her masts. This is one reason why Christ refers to himself as the bridegroom. So the marriage of Adam and Eve constituted the first domestic church. In this church, or Father's house, as Christ calls it, Adam allows the devil to sell his corrupt goods to his wife. Like in Genesis, where Adam observes the situation before taking action, Christ does this as well. So in John chapter 2, verse 14, it says, Jesus found in the temple them that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers of money sitting. In Genesis, we can imagine Adam happening upon his wife and observing the infernal money changer offering his sinful commodities. So in John chapter 2, verse 15, it says, Jesus made, as it were, a scourge of little cords. He drove them all out of the temple. This means that Jesus took the time to weave a handmade whip to inflict serious pain. I'll just pause for a sec. I find that pretty cool. We have this image of Christ happening upon and saying, what's going on here? And, freaking out and flipping tables. That's unfortunately how it's presented in modern, shows and things like that. But Christ has a perfect temperament. Christ is Christ. He's perfect at everything. So he sees what's going on, and it says he goes and he makes the knotted cord. Now, I've never made a knotted cord, but I have made rosaries before. And it's going to take me a good 25, 30 minutes. Maybe Christ is a little faster. I don't know. But the point is he's going to sit down and he's very calmly taking action. So I don't know how long this would have taken, as I said, but it was an intentional manufacturing of a weapon that he fully intended to use with force and purpose. Okay. This scourge, in my opinion, can be seen as a prefigurement of the most holy rosary of the Blessed Virgin Mary. See, John describes it as a scourge of little cords, which means a small handheld weapon that is either knotted or put together with small fragments that are like beads. Christ shows us in this instance that when we wield the rosary as our weapon to clear out our homes, we wield the power of Christ through the intercession of Mary. So in my opinion, this is an appropriate response to an intruder in the domestic church. Adam did the opposite and partook in the corrupt economy of sin. So that's, in my opinion, how I think that Christ gives us the example of using the rosary as a weapon against unlawful things happening in our house. And of course, I'm speaking mainly of from a spiritual perspective. But the rosary, in my opinion, is a defense against effeminacy. And also, one of the characteristics of effeminacy that we need to guard against is, I call it the blame game. That's so common today. Think about, think about a man who struggles with, internet vice, as we said. Our culture has psychologized this idea that if a man goes to the internet for those things, well, it must not be because his needs are being met. All that is blaming a wife. It's not your fault. So it's not my fault. It's your fault. That's the blame game. And effeminacy breeds blame amongst men and women. Because why? Accepting that you've made a mistake is really hard. Blaming somebody is really easy. Again, it's back to this reluctance to suffer due to an attachment to pleasure. So we understand effeminacy right now at this point. So what are some practical steps that we can do to start subduing our body, getting control of our passions, our appetites, and so forth? Well, in the book, I call this chapter Tame the Horse. Okay. Raise your hand because I can't hear you, but has anyone ever seen that movie, perhaps with your children or grandchildren? It's called Spirit. It's about a stallion like in the wilderness. No. Have you seen it? No, raise. Yeah. Anyway, my kids love that. Yeah, my kids love that movie. It's a fun little movie. It's basically about a Mustang in the, the Wild West and a Native American guy and the cowboys and things. It's a fun adventure story. But the one thing that I love about that movie is basically the Native American guy is really athletic. He's really strong in things, but he's really stubborn and he can't really control his temper. And the horse is kind of like the animal version of him. So I think of that as the sort of union between the body and the soul. And I've heard that before. I can't remember where, from some spiritual writer. But, that relationship between body and soul is like a rider and his horse. I've only ridden a horse but once in my life. I think I was when I was in Cub Scouts when I was 8 or 9 years old. But from what I've heard from people who love to ride horses, I have friends with a horse farm, and they say it's like you become one with the horse. It's almost like you're one thing together. It's quite an amazing thing. But it takes a breaking in to do so. And you see this in the movie where not only does the man have to be broken in, but he has to break the horse in. And there's this power struggle. And once the man gains control over the horse, he weirdly gains control over himself as well. So if we as the person, or if we imagine the man as the soul and the horse as the body, we see this relationship there where our body has to listen to our soul. And we're going to have to break our body in, and to do so. Because, it's a strange thing. I'm in control of myself. But sometimes I just don't stop myself from grabbing something off the counter when I shouldn't eat it. It's like I'm making myself do it, but I can't stop myself from doing it. It's going to take work to get over those habits. So one of the first things that we can do is get up earlier. In the book, I lay out, proof texting is a dangerous game. I mean, Protestants love to do that. Here's one verse. This explains our whole reason for having this new breakaway church. Okay. But there are dozens of verses in the Bible that are very explicit about why you should get up earlier. Okay. And I'll read a few of them here. So starting in, this is in Genesis. And Abraham got up early in the morning in the place where he had stood before the Lord. In Joshua, and rising early in the morning, he mustered his soldiers and went up with the ancients in front of the army, etc. In Job, yet if thou wilt arise early to God and will beseech the Almighty, etc. In the Psalms, God is in the midst thereof, it shall not be moved. God will help it in the early morning. And another proverb, I love them that love me, and they that in the morning early watch for me shall find me. Another proverb, well doth he rise early who seeketh good things, but he that seeketh after evil things shall be oppressed by them. Anyway, there's about a dozen or 15 verses I have in the book that show rising early is something that God desires. Now, obviously, hey, people have night shifts and things. Early might depend. I mean, if you work till 7 in the morning, you've got to sleep till 2 in the afternoon, I guess. That's a different thing. But the reason for that is because getting up is hard. It's one of the easiest, it's one of the most common things that we do is get up in the morning. Everyone has to get up in the morning. But it's so easy to sleep in. That snooze button is magnetic. I mean, I'm laying there and I think that it's just, there's like someone who walks into my room and takes my hand and forces me to touch that snooze button. It's so easy. But if we can just get over that, well, one day we're going to have to rise from the grave. Our body will have a bodily resurrection at the final judgment. I kind of think about it like this. If I force myself with stiff legs in the morning at 4:30 or whatever time it is, get a couple hours in before the kids are up to work out or pray and do all those sorts of things. Well, that's really, really hard. And every day I'm starting my day with something that is a saying no to pleasure and a saying yes to virtue. And I don't want to come off and say, I'm some sort of stoic, like I never eat sugar. That's not true at all. My wife is a world-class baker, and my belt is evidence of that. But the point is that we can enjoy the feasting in our faith if we fast. We can enjoy sleeping in on Sunday, for example. I always sleep in. I have 4 little kids. My oldest is 5 years old. Sleeping in means like 7:15. Okay. But I can enjoy getting the extra sleep or having a nap or something like that, because it's just like, if you've ever built a fence or something, I don't care what beer it is, but if you just spent 9 hours outside with your buddies building a fence in the hot July sun and you have an ice cold beer, it is the best thing that's ever happened on earth. Okay. And if we do things that are hard, then when it comes to do those things that are pleasurable, they're even better. Okay. So starting your day off by getting up early is one of those things. Another thing that we can do is chastening and mortifying. So St. Alphonsus Liguori, one of my favorite saints, he has a great quote. And he says, "He who wishes to find Jesus should seek him, not in the delights and pleasures of the world, but in mortification of the senses." The word chastity actually comes from the verb to chasten. Because to remain chaste, for example, even in marriage, because there's certain things that we can do, certain things we can't, you're saying no to pleasure. Reluctance to suffer attachment. You're saying no to pleasure in order to live virtuously. So when we say it's someone being chaste, it actually means, do they have control of themselves because they're able to say no to their lower appetites? That's literally what it means, chastity and to chasten. So chastening and mortifying the body, okay, we also see, for example, the word chastise, okay? So God gives us a chastisement. It basically means a punishment, okay? But there's a corrective purpose for that, okay? God sends a chastisement because the world is sinful, and the result is that we're purified, that sort of thing. We kind of have to do that to our bodies. We have to chasten our bodies, okay? And then we come to the word mortify, okay? And actually, sorry, before I continue, St. Paul even says this to us. He says, "For whom the Lord loveth, he chastiseth, and he scourgeth every son whom he receiveth." Basically he says, if God loves you, he's going to punish you. That's not part of the prosperity gospel. Isn't that the case? Father can probably attest to that. I bet you when he decided to go to the seminary, whenever you try to do something good for God, you will receive backlash that you never thought you would receive. That's what happens in our life. God sends us punishments and corrections so we don't get prideful and so forth. Okay. Mortification, mortifying, that actually comes from the word like death. Okay. So the Latin word for death, mors, M-O-R-S. All right. So mortification actually goes a step further from chastisement. Okay. For example, St. Paul says, "Always bearing about in our body the mortification of Jesus, that the life also of Jesus may be made manifest in our bodies." So Jesus doesn't receive a personal chastisement in the sense that he's guilty of any sin. Okay. And he doesn't have any need of correction for sinful appetites or behavior. Okay. But he does go through a mortification. It's a dying to self, is basically the point. Okay. So chastening is sort of this idea of punishing, and mortification is this idea of dying to self. They both go together. Okay. And so how do we chasten and mortify? Well, the one thing I said was waking up early. The next thing that we need to do is fasting. Okay. And okay, every year in the sort of, let's call it, I'm trying to be kind here. Sometimes in churches, the priests, and I know your priest isn't like this because he invited someone like me to talk to you. He's not worried about what you're going to hear. But sometimes, when Lent comes up, it's, oh, you should fast, but just try. Don't think about fasting as something hard. Maybe just fast from complaining. Maybe just, have one less chocolate bar per week or something. And granted, it's good to not complain, but fasting is supposed to be hard. It's going to depend on our health. You know, if you've got diabetes or something like that, that's a different story. Okay. And that's already a cross in and of itself. But we have to fast. Fasting is huge. Christ literally tells us some demons only come out with prayer and fasting. And in fact, the great exorcists will tell you that Father Ripperger and others, one of the reasons why exorcisms take so long nowadays, okay, they used to say, 2 or 3 sessions 50, 60 years ago, over a couple months, and they'd be gone always. Now it can take like 7 or 8 years. The reason is because there's no prayer and there's no fasting going on in people's lives at all. So when it gets to the point where they're completely possessed, they have no way to fight against the devil. There's probably various spiritual reasons why fasting is so important, but from a completely practical perspective, fasting makes you weak. And our faith is very paradoxical. When I am weak, I am strong. When I am down, the Lord lifts me up. These sorts of things, right? So when I die, I live. And this is the paradox of the Catholic faith. When we're weak, we have to rely on God. If I'm going to go 18 hours without eating, do that whole, intermittent fasting or something like that, the first few days of it is really tough. So for me to maintain my temper with my children, I have to pray more. And then if I get into that habit, well, eventually I get to the point where I'm saying no to certain, fleshly things. And I'm also relying on God for my strength. And then we see those verses like from Isaiah, he shall walk, he shall not be weary. We see those things start to come to life. It only happens through fasting. Fasting is mega important, and we need to do more of that. Also, physical exertion. So I'm a rugby coach. I did grow up playing football. Rugby is also a popular sport up here in Canada. So I love the rough games and things like that. And growing up, I did football, boxing, and rugby. Those were my main sort of things. I'm not just hard-headed in a metaphorical sense. I think my head is actually made of cement because it's amazing that I don't have any brain damage. But in any case, and my wife will tell you the same. But I got into working out as a young man just for sport reason. And I grew to love it. I love working out. It's sort of a habit. But not every man has to go and be Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not what I'm saying. Because in fact, going to the gym and things can also be a chance for vanity. And I always recommend, if possible, especially for husbands, actually for men who aren't married as well, but if you can, I always recommend having a home gym, even if you have to sacrifice on certain equipment. The only reason being, there's no modesty left in our culture. If you go to a local health club, we both, men and women, we have to help each other get to heaven. That's just a part of it. And men have to have self-control, but women also need to help men have self-control. It's kind of like, it would not be fair if I brought a chocolate cake in front of my wife and just always had it around her. Yes, she might say no to it, but she really likes chocolate cake, in the same way, men, we have to be careful with near occasion of sin. That's just the reality. Okay. And everyone has to get a hold of that. And we do, but being a near occasion of sin because of immodesty is just not a good thing. So I always recommend, if possible, getting a home gym. Anyway, but we don't have to we don't have to, like I said, work out like a bodybuilder. The reason I say physical exertion in the book is because there's lots of ways to do that. Okay. I have a friend, he's a dairy farmer. He's got 3 little girls, and he's a dairy farmer. He's up at 4 a.m. every day doing his chores and cleaning stalls. I mean, if anyone knows a farmer, he's working 60 hours a week in the barn in some way. Is a slow week, So I spend in the summer with field time in the harvest in the September, October. The guy's a machine. It's absurd for me to say, hey, his name's JP, you should go work out too. That's nuts. The guy he couldn't gain weight if he tried, because he's always physically exerting himself. But most of us, we don't have that. I'm now kind of an author, I guess, is the main thing that I do. I sit on a chair a lot. So I need to find ways to get up and physically exert myself. For some people, that might be working out with weights. For others, lots of different things to do. Running, body weight stuff, even just hard things. We have a lot of snow where I live. I actually live, not only am I in Canada, but I'm in an area in Canada, in Ontario, called the Snow Belt. So I'm in the snowiest part of the snowy country. And we don't have a snowblower because I have a shovel. So yeah, it's a little bit hard, and it takes me 25 minutes, and I'm really sweating after. But a couple times a week or however, depending on the season, I could use a snowblower. And maybe when I'm a little bit older and I keep throwing my kids, or I'll probably put up my back one day, and then maybe I'll be happy I need to use a snowboard. But while I can, that's a chance for me to have physical exertion. Lots of different ways we do that in our life. We're just choosing the hard thing over the easy thing. Another thing too is our attachments to our phones, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody. Okay, phones are one of the most useful but addictive things on earth. They're actually engineered. I mean, mine's right here, and these screens, they're literally they consult psychologists and people who understand how the brain works in order to make addictive color settings so it's pleasing to look at. I mean, it's a losing battle to try to not look at that thing. So you got to find a way to regulate that. And practical ways to do that, I'm downstairs at dinner time. I just put it upstairs. I don't touch it till bedtime. My wife, everyone who knows me has my wife's phone number. If my mom falls and breaks her hip or something like that, she'll get a hold of us, and I'll check Twitter later or something, little things like that. Okay. How long are you guys able to go? Whatever, I keep going. Everyone. Okay, good. Okay. So I move on in the book to talk about the problem of neo-paganism and the New Age. Well, what I mean by that is, listen, we live in a society that used to be Christian. Canada, Quebec was legitimately a Catholic nation. It was one of the strongest Catholic, even though it was in Canada, it was like one of the strongest Catholic European nations left on earth. You guys are down in Louisiana, so les Cadiens, right? We share some sort of French diaspora heritage. Louisiana is historically a pretty Catholic place. Mike Church is a friend of mine. If any of you know him, Crusade Radio, I like him. He's got great bow ties. But Canada, the rest of Canada, I mean, it's a mix, just like the States. Christianish, kind of Protestant. We're kind of Anglican here, the English sort of thing. And in the States, it's obviously a mix of Puritan and everything in between, right? But that's all gone. Even the let's say the momentum of the old Christian culture that was fading but still around when the settlers came over, it's gone. I mean, we live in just watch the news. Well, don't watch the news because it's bad for your health. But watch the inauguration and stuff. I mean, just watch what's going on, and you just go, there's no virtue left on this continent at all. I mean, it's basically gone. I'm being a little bit facetious, but the point is that Christ is not in the picture in our society. People, though, are not atheists when they fall. That's one of the biggest myths of communism, is that atheism is like the natural, true human state. That's wrong. The fallen natural human state is paganism. This is why immediately after the fall of Adam and Eve, we see in the Bible the proliferation of worshiping idols. This is why King David tells us in the Psalms, the gods of the nations are demons. These occult things, yoga and all this kind of stuff, this is devil worship. No, it doesn't mean if you did yoga one time at your community center, and I've back in the day before I was a practicing Catholic, you don't like catch it. It's not like catching cooties. You catch a cold, you catch a demon. That's not what it's like, okay? But these things that we do, these things are pagan in our society. And there's actually a difference. And my favorite author is G.K. Chesterton. He's my favorite. And he talks about, before Christianity, he calls it a warm paganism. And what he meant by that was man was finding his way up to Christ. So even though there were problems, you think about the Greek philosophers, you think about the Roman Stoics and things like that. They had a trajectory towards virtue and the truth, Aristotle and so forth. This is why Thomas Aquinas can use Aristotle. But so we kind of apexed, and we get to this point where we've reached the mountaintop. It's the city of God. We've reached the Catholic Church. Okay. But then as we begin to reject things in our society, we actually have a descent. So anything good that was towards the truth, even though we were pagans, we were on the right path. Now we've rejected our faith and we're descending away from the truth. So it's like a brutal, evil, cold demonism that we devolve into. And that's what's happening in our society. This is why, abortion is a sacrament for the devil, the way that it's talked about by the pro-choice people. I mean, I could go on. Everything that's exalted in our society is the opposite of good. Anyway, I won't go on too much about it. But the point is because of that, this is fruitful, fertile soil for paganism and demonism in our homes. And we must guard against this. And in my opinion, again, like a lot of things, men and women, we share 80%. But there's certain things, as I've seen, and I've done a little bit of working with, priests and deliverance ministry and things like that. You got to be careful with that. Sometimes people get a little bit too cavalier with that. But I've seen some things and read a lot of stuff, especially for this book. And this is what I have in the book about how, the main ways that paganism or demonism will affect women. And the first one is yoga. Okay, and this is a Hindu ritual. It's not compatible with Catholicism. Okay, any practice based in a tradition that worships the gods is a worship of demons. As I said, for the gods of the nations or the Gentiles are devils. That's what King David tells us. Now, Protestants are wrong in their objection to the Catholic statues and art as idols referred to pagan and demonic things. Okay, that always comes up. There are numerous other places in the scriptures that refer to the gods as idols. The Holy Bible is clear. The gods of the pagans are demons. Some will say that you can practice yoga merely as a form of exercise. Now listen, of course there are certain things that are just like lunging. A lunge is a lunge is a lunge. I mean, it's a genuflection. It's just kind of a movement that you do. But this is the example I use, okay? People will say, well, I just do yoga for the exercise. Oh, really? Okay. Let's say you have a friend who's an atheist or a non-Catholic or something. And you say, listen, I want you to come to Mass with me. Don't worry. It's not religious. I just want you to come to church. Okay, well, what am I supposed to do when I get there? Well, you're just going to kneel when we kneel. You're just going to put your hands together and you're just going to do all the things that we do, but don't worry, you're not participating in the Mass. And he would say, you idiot, like you're telling me to go to church. I don't want to do that. I mean, it's the same thing with yoga. It's like, don't worry, it's not religious. Well, hold on. You're in the place with all the statues of the actual idols, of the actual demons. The hippie whatever that comes out to do the class is saying all these phrases in Sanskrit or Hindu languages or something, and basically telling you to sort of find your inner. The point is she's leading you through what is a ritual traditionally, and you're saying it's just exercise. What we do with our body affects our soul. Again, back to the analogy of the horse and the person who rides. What we do with our body affects our soul. This is why St. Paul, he talks about sinning against our own bodies when it comes to impurity. What we do with our body affects our soul. Okay. So yoga is number one. Now, the next, mindfulness. Now, has anyone here ever heard of mindfulness meditation? Is it something come up? I traditionally am by trade, I'm a school teacher. So I've sat through a lot of professional development meetings and all this kind of stuff. And they tried to push this mindfulness stuff on us. And I looked into it. I'm like, this is just Buddhism. Now, like with all heresies, there is a grain of truth. Mindfulness will tell you, sit still, breathing exercises. That's fine. In fact, there's certain mystics and stuff in our church that will talk about how to put yourself in the presence of God. Stillness is good, whatever. But the problem with mindfulness is that it's a complete emptying of yourself, which is partly good because we want to be filled with Christ, but there's no mention of Christ in mindfulness. And you are supposed to sort of find yourself and find the inner light and things like that. Mindfulness is a Buddhist practice, and it's a very sneaky one because it is largely psychologically healthy. However, you look into it and you will always find Eastern spirituality. It's impossible to avoid it. There is a group out there. They call it Catholic mindfulness. I've looked into them. It's actually led by people who are exorcists. And there's exorcists that consult. I was highly skeptical of it when I looked into it. I don't know why they call it Catholic mindfulness, because to me that's very off-putting. When I looked into what they were doing, it actually looked like pretty traditional prayer practices. But mindfulness itself, in the secular sense, is just Buddhism and needs to be avoided. Okay. Occult practices. Okay, so if we start hearing the windows shut, the internet cuts out, we'll know why we're talking about the devil. So, occult practices. Well, these are the new age and demonic activities where people are clearly seeking the preternatural. Okay. Preternatural is the demons and the angels. We often say supernatural, but that's technically speaking reserved for God. So occult practices include things like Ouija boards, palm reading, mediums, tarot cards, channeling, witchcraft, Satanism, and everything else. Popular shows and music all rely on these things heavily. Various children's fictions like Harry Potter will use these symbols as well. Satanism is growing as our other occult practices and exorcists are struggling to meet the demand. Men, of course, participate in occult things as well, but there is a strange insistence on this idea of priestesses or goddesses in the occult, which appeals to women. I don't know a single man, and maybe this is rare, but I don't know a single man I know who's ever told me that he just came and talked to his psychic or his tarot card reader. But I could probably tell you half a dozen women I know. And I'm basically a traditional Catholic at this point, and we don't live near I don't know a lot of people who are don't go to the Catholic Church anymore, but I still hear about people. When I teach students at a Catholic school, oh, when Grandpa died, my mom went to someone so we could talk to Grandpa, it was a seance or something. This thing is just, women are so relational, which is obviously an amazing characteristic, but if it becomes perverted because of vice or sin or whatever, there's this aspect of occult spirituality where you feel things, and I think that's the reason why it is. I don't know why. Men tend to say, oh, that's just superstition or whatever, but I'll get into men right now and how we go into paganism. Okay, so men and paganism. This is from Father Gabriel Amorth. He was formerly the chief exorcist of the Vatican, or the Diocese of Rome, I should say. And he said the most frequent weak points in men are from time to time always the same: pride, money, and lust. Okay, so what are the traps that men fall into? Science worship is a big one. Think about this whole coronavirus thing. You guys are sitting there. You're not socialist distancing, and I can actually see your faces. So I think you're able to think for yourself. But let's look, seriously, think about this Anthony Fauci guy. He's like the high priest of a new cult. He can change truth on a daily basis. Read about the Aztecs when they would go to revelations from the gods. Okay. One day the gods want this. Then the gods change their mind. And the next day they want something else. Why? Well, that's what the gods decided. One day we should cover our faces. One day we shouldn't cover our faces because that's silly. If you can breathe through the mask, then you're not going to be able to stop the virus that you breathe out. Then the next day, well, if you don't wear a mask, you're going to kill everybody. Well, why? I don't know, because the high priest said so. Like, it really functions like a sort of paganism. And we need to sacrifice everything in our lives to ward off these evil demons who are very angry with us. I won't keep going, but the point is, it's a cult mentality right now. There's no logic to it whatsoever. And we all look to these experts, especially this man, Anthony Fauci. And this doesn't come out of nowhere, okay? This is from our scientism, okay? It's a scientistic thing. Evolutionism is a big part of that, okay? Now, I know some people say, okay, the Catholic Church, there's multiple ways that you can interpret certain parts. That's true. There's multiple ways that are within the bounds of de fide dogma statements. But this idea of molecules to man and apes and, giving birth, it's silly. It's literally heresy. Okay. There's no way. If you actually look into the background of the faith and the de fide statements, councils, tradition, the church fathers, there's just no room for it. But it's shoved down our throat. Why? Because, well, ultimately, it's a superstitious belief. It's a demonic creation myth. In creation, it's a top-down approach. Evolution is a bottom-up approach. Well, who's underneath us? It's not God. Okay, so it's an opposite approach. It's a reversal. The devil always has. So men fall into science worship often. Evil images. That's a word, for pornography. Okay, I have a full chapter on that, but we won't go over and we don't have time to go over the whole chapter. But people say to me, what does that have to do with paganism? Well, it has to do with, it's this. The things that are most important to your life, you'll worship those things. Men who participate, and women do as well, but it's more common in men, unfortunately, because it's growing in women, but it's more historically common as a man thing, okay? It's ultimately worship of self. because he's committing the sin against himself and imagining himself as Lord over this thing. I won't go too much into it because I don't want to be scandalous, but I think you get my point. And actually, here's something, and if I learned this when I was teaching 14, 15-year-old boys, and I wanted to scare them straight, getting away from this sin. I could take the air out of a room real quick when I would bring up this topic. And it's an inherently homosexual activity. Why is that? Because the man is, well, he's the agent of pleasure to his own self. And I read that one place, and I went, oh my goodness, that's exactly it. So this is why this activity has to be pushed on our society. And what do we look at in the Bible? We see Book of Romans, and St. Paul talks about how when societies devolve into paganism, God gives them up to unnatural devices. These things go hand in hand. This is how the paganism makes its way back into the life of men. Okay. Health is as an avenue for paganism. Well, how can that be? Well, I'm not talking about taking vitamin C or whatever. What I'm talking about is the worship of health. And again, talk about corona. I wrote this book before coronavirus, but we're going to have different. It's like BC and CE, or AD and BC, whatever the historians say. Now we're going to have like before corona and AC after corona for the way that we live now. But in any case, men, health is good. That's fine. But I used to work out, for football and things like that. So I would, go to the health food stores and the gyms and whatever. And man, there's like a pseudo-religious belief in a lot of things in the health community. Men, the same man will tell you that believing in God is a superstitious thing, and then he'll sit there and talk your ear off about this 2% performance increase in testosterone because of this like Chinese doctor he just visited who gave them these pills to take every day. The lengths that people will go to for performance is astounding, and men are extremely culpable of that. And the reason why it comes back to this paganism as well is, you even see this in bodybuilding. You see this in the bodybuilding culture, which working out is great, but bodybuilding as a sport is extremely distorted. It's just a sport of vanity. But the reason is every man basically wants to turn himself into a Greek god. It's part of that original sin of men wanting equality with their creator. Okay. Money, as the exorcist, Father Amor said at the beginning of the chapter, money. It's not true that money is the root of all evil. Okay. People misuse that, but it's the love of money that is the root of all evil. And that's in 1 Timothy. Men will sacrifice almost anything to the gods of money in today's world. Family size has to be small. Marriage is to be delayed. Virtue is ignored, all in the pursuit of the god of cash. Okay. And we see this ultimately with, if you're familiar with Moloch or Baal, basically one of the gods of the Old Testament, he requires child sacrifice. Okay. The temple of child sacrifice nowadays is called Planned Parenthood. And boyfriends will drop off their girlfriends to appease the gods of prosperity, meaning, well, I can't do this. I can't have a child right now because I need to be rich. That's it. That's basically it. Sacrificing the youth. And that's what's going on with coronavirus as well. For something that primarily affects the elderly, who can make their own decisions. Maybe the old people want to go see their grandkids. They should have probably asked them that beforehand, eh? And but we're sacrificing the education of children. We're sacrificing their friendships. I mean, I have 4 small kids. I'm lucky I live in a small town. Our friends are all, they know what's going on. So we haven't had any major problems in our social life. But Canada, Ontario, where I live, the province, it's the most locked down place in North America. It's more locked down than California. That demonic government is somehow opening up that state right now, and our province is doubling down. So the effect on children has been insane. And this is part of that same sacrificing the children for prosperity. That's exactly what we're seeing right now. It's a personification of it. Okay. Now, I move on in the book to talk about pornography. I won't go into that too much because I've already explained it a bit. One important thing here is the media. Okay. I won't talk too much at length about the media, but one thing that we have to understand, there is no such thing as media anymore. Media just means technology. This is a form of media. What we have now is we have propaganda. That's what we have. Our culture, we live in a communist culture. Our Lady told us that the errors of Russia would spread if things weren't done properly. Sister Lucia told us that all nations would be subdued by communism in some fashion. Okay, look what's happened with your guys' election, and don't worry, you have good company because we've had the 30 years younger than Joe Biden type guy anyway for the last few years. So maybe you guys are still better off than us in a sense. But the point being is we have communism, okay, and because of that we have propaganda. And what that means is we just get messages. We just get messages and messages and messages. Doesn't matter if we call it the news, it's just propaganda. And if we let that seep into our lives, into our homes, it'll affect our souls and it'll affect our families. So we have to guard against the temptations. We need to be informed for certain things, especially, but we need to be very careful with that. And also too, I've seen this as well. I have a part in the book called Snakes in the Garden. And I talk about, Genesis, and my students would always ask me, they'd say, well, how did the snake get into the garden? I don't know, God allowed it for some reason. But the point is, once the snake's in the garden, once we let in the threats into our home, whether it's on purpose or not, we then have to get them out. Okay, so I'm not anti-technology by any means. I'm sitting here on a Zoom conference, but our children, we're very careful with the technology. We actually have a VHS player. We found it at a flea market, and because we go into the thrift store, you can get a box of old movies, and anyway, but we're very careful because I know that, okay, sure, YouTube's fine for a grown-up who can handle himself, but YouTube has like a kids function. Well, what messages are we sending kids nowadays? Do I really think that the people at YouTube know what's good for my kids? That's absurd. Amazon Prime or whatever. I mean, you have your subscription and you can watch the movies and things. The point is, we realized with our kids, we couldn't even. It was inappropriate even for us to have the menu of the streaming service open in front of the kids, because sure, it's like a kids show, but it's sexualized, or it's a kids show, but it has pagan imagery, because why not? That's what they want out of the media. So media is a huge temptation, okay, for bringing snakes into the garden. Video games are not intrinsically evil. I haven't played a video game in a long time, but there's nothing wrong with just playing Madden NFL with some buddies, or there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But it is a major temptation, okay? And a lot of the content in certain video games is very immoral. Even as a kid, and I was not a practicing Catholic, but there was that game Grand Theft Auto, and there's many iterations of that, and it's but it had a function where basically the guy you're playing in the game could hire a prostitute, and then they sort of depicted that in the game somehow. I remember even as like a 20-year-old talking to a buddy, and he was trying to explain to me, he's like, no man, it's just realistic. And I'm thinking, do you know how creepy you have to be as the designer of a video game to go to work and sit down and spend hours with the coding and everything to make that happen, and then record this? Anyway, I'm just like, that's insane. Even then I thought, this is insane. I mean, how is this something that would just, oh, you're 13 years old, it says 13 and up? Nonsense. Okay, so we have to be on guard for media. I have a chapter in the book called Building a Domestic Church, and one of the themes that I have in that chapter it's called Out of Egypt. Okay, so look at the Exodus, right? The Exodus is actually pretty quick. They leave Egypt within, I don't know, days and weeks. It's pretty fast. Then how long does it take before they're allowed to go to the promised land? Decades. It's easy to leave Egypt. It's really hard to get Egypt out of ourselves, okay? And we see this with, we're talking about people who literally walked across the Red Sea being parted. I mean, talk about proof of your faith. You're seeing the most amazing miracles. And then you go into demon worship when Moses goes up the mountain. That's what happens, the golden calf. And it says in there, they rose up to play. That's a euphemism for ritualistic sexual debauchery. That's what that means. So these Israelites, the Hebrews, they were in this pagan society, and they tried to maintain their Hebrew traditions, but they melded them with the culture. Then they had to leave, but they still took those pagan traditions with them. And when they let their guard down, they overtook them again. That's what happens. We need to get Egypt out of our souls. Leaving it, it's not just enough. Okay, we have to do both. I talked about in the book prayer. I won't go too much into that right now. I'm not a spiritual master, so I'm not giving, there's better books to read about, the perfect spiritual life sort of thing. But a big inspiration, I actually call the chapter, it's called Camel Knees, and there's a reason for that. Okay. So sounds totally strange, but in the book of church history, which was written by the ancient historian Eusebius of Caesarea, we read of St. James the Apostles. I believe he was St. James the Lesser, if I'm not mistaken. There was two St. James, but he was the bishop of Jerusalem, okay? In his account of the martyrdom of James, it says, Eusebius says that the following about St. James' prayer life. It literally says, he was in the habit of entering alone into the temple and was frequently found upon his knees begging forgiveness for the people, so that his knees became hard like those of a camel, in consequence of his constantly bending them in worship of God. So good old camel knees, St. James. He prayed so hard that his knees got calluses so messed up, they looked like a camel. So it just underscores how important prayer is in our life. And, again, your priest is wearing a cassock, so you probably get some pretty good information from the pulpit. But sometimes we see prayer as this, it's got to be spontaneous. No, listen, that's fine. Hey, the great saints have given us spontaneous prayers, and we all have to pray from our hearts when we're in dialogue with God, and that's important. But there's a reason why we have a wealth of prayers from the saints. Their recipes are better than my recipe. It's like my nonna, God rest her soul. My mom's an Italian immigrant, so I grew up in this Italian kitchen. And people might disagree that she had the best lasagna on earth. They'd be wrong, because she did have the best lasagna on earth. But the point is like she perfected it. I could never make it better than her. Okay, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. It's a physical impossibility for me to make better lasagna than my nonna, God rest her soul. Why would I ever change that? It's just silly. It's the same thing with some of our prayers in our faith. The rosary is perfect. Okay. The divine office is already there for us. The spiritual masters have already given it. Let's go to those. And then, even with the saints too, sure, they get to the point where they're having these ecstatic experiences and things, but that's after years. In very special cases like Padre Pio and things, okay, as children, they're having these, miraculous events and things. But most often with these great saints, it's entering the monastery and going through the novitiate and fasting and mortifying. And years later, they find themselves as a spiritual master. We have to have the same approach in our lives as well. I have a chapter in the book called Lead On, Brave Heart, I Will Follow. I go through the true history of Braveheart. It's a little bit different than the movie, but it's still one of the greatest movies ever made. And I talk about the need for a crusade. And actually, here's an interesting thing about Braveheart. Have you people here seen the movie, the original? I mean, I'm sure it's Mel Gibson. We as Catholics, we have to kind of watch every Mel Gibson movie. That's like the Catholic obligation now for Hollywood. But in the movie, Robert the Bruce and Mel Gibson are basically, they took some poetic license there. In real life, Braveheart was actually Robert the Bruce. There was William Wallace, but the name Braveheart was actually applied to Robert the Bruce. And here's where the story of Braveheart comes from. So Robert the Bruce was actually a greatly pious man. He was and he didn't backstab William Wallace like in the movie. That's fine. It makes for a great film, but history is a little bit different. And he wanted to go on a crusade before he died. Unfortunately, later in life, he was king for about 20 years at this point. And he experienced, I believe, something. They think it was a stroke, and it caused his health to deteriorate pretty quickly. He wasn't going to make it to a crusade, basically, and that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to fight for the church. I mean, he was a son of God. He was a son of the church, and so he actually had his best friend and his counsel. He agreed, and they actually had a dispensation from the bishop that when he died, his friend would actually have his heart cut out and brought with him on the crusade, so he could go to Jerusalem and be there in the fight for the faith. That's pretty hardcore. And so they end up his friend goes on battle. They end up not getting as far as Israel. They get caught in Spain against the Moors, which was the Muslim forces, and that was another crusade going on there. The group gets completely surrounded, and there's no way out. This is going to be their death. So In order to muster up the truth, his friend takes out the heart in the case and holds it up and says, "Lead on, brave heart. I will follow thee." And he actually throws Robert the Bruce's heart into battle, and they all follow and go and die a great death. It's pretty insane. It's pretty hardcore, but it's pretty inspiring. And that's like, this, we have to follow the heart of Christ. We have the Sacred Heart has to be part of our life. Okay. We have to be prepared to go on crusade in this culture that we live in, because the enemy is at the door, and it's going to take great bravery for that. And finally, in the book, I talk about the Blessed Virgin Mary, and specifically about Our Lady of Guadalupe. And Our Lady, she's our only hope at this point. She will crush the serpent's head. Our Lady of Fatima predicted a reign of peace if things were done properly. She promised to that triumph of her Immaculate Heart. These things need to happen, and we need to rely on our mother. And even Christ, as he's being crucified, he looks down at his mother. Okay? We're going to have to go through a type of martyrdom in our culture, whether it's a white martyrdom or a red martyrdom. Either one, it's going to be suffering. And we need to have our Blessed Mother with us. And if you could take anything from this, I would say, I kind of start the book talking about Mary and how the rosary is right there as the thing that beats effeminacy. And I end the book talking about the Virgin Mary, because she is our only hope. And I list countless stories in the book about miracles of the rosary, into battles. I mean, Our Lady of Lepanto, or the Battle of Lepanto with Our Lady of the Rosary. There's countless stories about that. And the rosary is going to be the weapon. I mean, it is Padre Pio called it his weapon. If someone would not have their rosary, he'd slap them and he'd say, "Go get your sword." We need the rosary today. There's nothing else. And in the book also, I include, I go through the litany of Saint Joseph, and I have all of the different, about 10 or 12 different names. And I talk about what those mean for us. So, lover of poverty, pillar of families, chaste guardian of the Virgin, etc. And I I had not like a mystical experience, but I kind of grew a really strong devotion to Saint Joseph a couple years ago. And I had actually already written this book. It just came to me. I started writing this book like September the 2nd. I was done by October the 3rd or something like that. I got up every morning, and it was like I just had to do it. It just was like breathing. It just came out. And I went away on a retreat, and I didn't know what to call the book. And I was in a chapel that had a beautiful image of St. Joseph at this retreat house. And I just kept hearing terror of demons, terror of demons. And I never had a devotion to St. Joseph before this. Then I realized my middle name's Joseph, which I never clued into. That's like, seriously, I never thought about my life. And I'm born on the vigil of St. Joseph's feast day, March 18th. And I just realized that this book was about him, because this was about a true Catholic man. And, he's our perfect model for that. So I ended up writing an appendix for the book, and a series of articles that I include in there about St. Joseph. So that's bulk of what I have to say. I've probably overloaded you with information at this point. See you later.